In 2002, Disney released a feature animated film titled Treasure Planet that merged traditional 2D animation with 3D CG animation and their deep canvas technology in a fusion that enriches one of the best stories ever told by Disney Animation Studios, at least in my opinion. Unfortunately, the film was considered a failure at the box office by Disney standards, which was partly due to the film's costly production budget. The high budget can be accredited to the use of 3D animation throughout the film with the Pirate Silver's cyborg elements, in tandem with the constant presence of deep canvas with the RLS Legacy, the ship that most of the film took place on. But other Disney Animation Studios films from that time featured moments of 3D or deep canvas animation and were financially successful. Take Tarzan, for example. Without getting too far down this specific rabbit hole, it may be the case that Disney Animation Studios wanted to fully shift production to 3D animated feature films due to Pixar's success at the box office with their in-house style of volumetric 3D animations, and intentionally did not market Treasure Planet very well, and then used the film's poor box office performance to justify fully shifting focus in later years. While the last fully 2D animation from Disney Animation Studios was 2009's The Princess and the Frog, I believe that Treasure Planet represents an early and shining model of intertwining 2D and 3D animation successfully. But why even bother to integrate these 3D elements into the traditional 2D animation? Well, because of Tin Toy, a short film directed by a man named John Lasseter. He worked at a small computer graphics company named Pixar, owned by one Steve Jobs, who gave him the green light for the project, which eventually caught the attention of Disney, leading to Pixar and Disney's collaboration in 1995's Toy Story, 1998's A Bug's Life, and 1999's Toy Story 2. And in 2001, Disney Pixar's Monsters, Inc. and DreamWorks Animation's Shrek did well enough at the box office to encourage both studios to fully shift gears to 3D animated feature films in later years. Releasing in 2002, after the success of all of these films, just a year after Shrek, Treasure Planet may have just released too late. While Treasure Planet may have integrated traditional 2D animation technologies with new 3D animation technologies really well, Disney wanted to leave 2D animation behind entirely, as was evident when Disney acquired Pixar in 2006 for over $7 billion. But what if I told you that I don't really think Treasure Planet came out too late? What if it came out too early? And what if this film, featuring a strange amalgamation of 2D and 3D animation that was considered a failure by Disney, was instead the ethos for a film? What if there was a film that wasn't 2D, wasn't 3D, but maybe somewhere in between? A 2.5D, an incomplete fusion of varied animation technologies and elements that flaunts the style by bringing attention to the imperfections for diegetic and emotional weight? What if there was some recently released film that fit that model? Let's not forget the Fleischers were mixing animation with other animation mediums or even other filmic mediums over 100 years ago. Consider the appearance of Coco the Clown in Out of the Inkwell, the tantalizing fly from 1919. This isn't new ground. And this is where I reveal to you that this video isn't about Treasure Planet or Pixar. This video is about the Spider-Verse. But even to approach what some have dubbed the non-photorealistic rendering and the animation style of the Spider-Verse films, we have to acknowledge that these films start with a 3D chassis, whereas Treasure Planet had more of a 2D chassis. When Miles first gets his powers, he's depicted running down the street and panicking, and he reassures himself, it's a normal spider and I'm a normal kid. His face is captured in close-up, and you can almost see the non-textured 3D model of Miles under the layers of 2D expression lines, diagonally shadowed hatch lines, and Ditko dots. I mention this to highlight that 3D animation is still very much the hegemonic norm for feature animation film. And one need not look any further than this year's top-grossing film, Illumination's The Super Mario Bros. Movie, which made over $1.3 billion in the worldwide box office. But in looking at the current historical moment, there appears to be a counter-programming developing to the hegemonic 3D animation style. Films like Into and Across the Spider-Verse, along with a handful of other films, are attempting to initiate a broad-scale shift over to what I have dubbed an incomplete 2.5D animation. I would even say that Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse kicked off this moment back towards 2D animation styles when it exploded onto the scene in mid-December of 2018, creating a word-of-mouth buzz that helped make it successful in the box office. The film was so influential to animated feature films as a medium that in the years since Into the Spider-Verse, nearly every major animation studio has picked up the style and attempted to run with it, while Sony greenlit 2 sequels, the first of which is Across the Spider-Verse. It was immediately successful at the box office and continues to advance the style with more diverse stylistic choices within the animation, but more about that later. The incomplete 2.5D style I'm speaking of should be familiar to most film goers and streaming aficionados at this point, but just in case, let's cover some of the influences the style pulls from. The animators of Into the Spider-Verse imply that their biggest influence is, of course, comic books. This influence can be located in the many hatching lines that indicate shadows, the frequent inclusion of speech balloons, and especially the enormity of Ditko dots that appear throughout both Spider-Verse films. Not to mention the constant color mismatches that surround characters and environments, which simulate the color mismatching that would often occur when comic books were being mass-produced during the golden age and silver age of comic books. Here's one great example of everything I just mentioned from the moment I showed earlier when Miles was panicking. Boom, hatch lines on his face, Ditko dots on his jacket, speech balloon of his thoughts in the background. And the characters in the background begin to color mismatch to imply distance from the camera. Now check this out. After Miles nearly gets hit by a taxi, only to be saved by his new spider powers, he springs into the air, and the higher he gets into the air during this jump over the taxi, the more his colors begin to mismatch, and the more he becomes Spider-Man. There are also many of what Danny Dimian, the visual effects supervisor of Into the Spider-Verse, has dubbed pop frames. These are the hand-drawn frames that seem to pop in during action sequences that visually mirror the exact style of a comic book panel, in their rich color and deep shadows flattening the image for a rather impressionistic composition. As that might imply that animators were extremely interested in allowing an illustrative or painterly quality to the animation, as is present in the brushstrokes that appear within the backgrounds, environments, and on objects. This aesthetic can also be seen in the elements that appear to be penciled in, most predominantly featured in Across the Spider-Verse with Spot's character design. Josh Beveridge, the head of character animation on Into the Spider-Verse, also states that the film feels like it's all printed in ink and feels like an illustration on every frame. And Beveridge is right. Each freeze frame I've had up are just random timeline selections I made while I had the film paused. The lack of motion blur and depth of field coupled with excellently textured environments and characters allow a visual clarity here that is just unmatched in Pixar's and DreamWorks 3D animation features. The animators also cite anime as a deep inspiration, not just for characters like Penny Parker, but throughout the production itself. Speed lines and impact lines, as well as doubles, occur almost everywhere throughout the film when movement and impacts occur, accentuating every character's interaction with their environments. The animators also claim to pull inspirations from video games, though this aesthetic within the style may be the hardest to locate. But if I were pressed, I would point to the dynamic camera angles that appear during action sequences, which to my mind seem reminiscent of cutscenes in video games. All these sources of inspiration congeal into a film that features 2D lines over a character's 3D model to imply and exaggerate facial movements, while the backgrounds and environments are deconstructed and abstracted in various ways to consistently elicit the incompleteness in existence and drawn comedy qualities. Deconstructions of environments and backgrounds constantly serve to evoke subjective emotional experiences of the characters, as their diegetic feelings and experiences become what drive the experimentation in the form. And the two Spider-Verse films are rife with emotional turmoil, committed to primarily portraying non-white or non-male identities, not to highlight the chaos, but to find a way to navigate through these identities and the relationships that inform them. To this end, the Spider-Verse films reserve a special significance for individual love and embraces, or hugs especially. During these moments of embrace, or the absence of embrace, the character's subjective emotional experience is transferred onto the background and the environment around them in impressionistic and abstract compositions that beautifully and succinctly constitute the protagonist's subjectivity onto their world. As it would happen, Pixar has had forays back into 2D animations within a few other of their 3D animated films. Both Ratatouille and Inside Out feature short sequences of 2D animation that interact with or take over the 3D animated style entirely. Even more recently in Elemental, there is a short sequence of 2D animation, while both the fire and water elements seem to feature various components of 2D and 3D animation throughout the film. But as I stated, this video isn't really about Pixar. This video is about the Spider-Verse. So I would like to look at a few sequences where I've located my prior reading of how the Spider-Verse films experiment with animation, exhibiting the animator's influences and simultaneously depicting the character's subjective emotional experience as informed by their specified identities. Let's start with Into the Spider-Verse, and let's start small. After the other Spider people have gone back to their universe, Peter B. Parker is still left behind. As Peter and Miles argue, the background of Ditko dots is Spider-Man blue and red, solidifying Miles as a Spider-Man on equal footing with Peter. Miles is situated screen right, immersed in red tones, while Peter is situated on screen left and bathed in blue tones, which both accentuate their individual outfits and help them pop. But after Miles sweeps Peter's legs and dangles him over the reactor core, Peter's background becomes a bright yellow, pointing to the hope and optimism Miles has for Peter when he returns to his own universe. The leap of faith he reminds Peter of in the moment. But this also might suggest Peter's own cowardice in the face of returning. But I think the presence of Mayday Parker in Across the Spider-Verse suggests Peter's yellow background here implies an optimism for his return to his own universe. And as Peter disappears and Miles pulls his mask back down, once again fully embodying Spider-Man, the Ditko dot background is fully blue and red, as if to say he is this universe's Spider-Man. He crests over the side of the building to face Kingpin, and Miles' background shifts into deep blue tones, while it's revealed that Kingpin's figure is where all of the red tones have been emanating from. While this obviously depicts Kingpin as the threat in the scene, I think the deep blue tones behind Spider-Man indicate his eternally precarious position as this universe's Spider-Man, as is revealed in Across the Spider-Verse, and further his instability in the formation of his own identity. To consider Miles' identity, we need to consider the superhero's identity within the filmic space for a moment. In Richard Newby's Hollywood Reporter article, Into the Spider-Verse and the Importance of a Biracial Spider-Man, he makes a few rather lofty claims about Spider-Man and, by extension, superheroes. He first implies that part of the reason behind Spider-Man's accessibility is because he doesn't operate on terms of race. He then goes on to obliterate his own claim by suggesting that the subtext concerning Miles' identity is evident across the film, which is an obvious enough statement. Sure, Miles struggles with the formation of his identity, attempting to navigate his Puerto Rican and Black American backgrounds. And as Newbie suggests, Miles is also actively forming his own Black masculinity, as informed by the two men in his life who constitute their Black masculinity in vastly different ways, though both exhibit tenderness and love for Miles. And while these characterizations are evident in the film, Newbie attempts to go further by suggesting the presence of Miles' hoodie is an affirmation that wearing a hoodie doesn't make Black and brown kids the menaces or thugs that the news media so often portrays them as, but individuals just as capable of heroism and growth as anyone. And while I would totally agree with that claim, as well as his suggestion that we needed Miles and this film for the cathartic political release that it allowed in the years following the Obama administration, by taking these positions, he demolishes the claim that Spider-Man doesn't operate on terms of race. Instead, I think Spider-Man, and most if not all superheroes, operate specifically on terms of race. In Eric Cesar Morales' essay on Into the Spider-Verse, he recognizes the inherent coding of otherness into superheroes and how important it is that Miles is Afro-Latino. He says, superhero films have become part of the cultural zeitgeist of the 21st century, and having a Latino or Afro-Latino protagonist is long overdue. Not since Zorro has a Latino character come close to portraying a superhero who dominates the silver screen. And Bob Kane credits Zorro as his inspiration in creating Batman. Zorro is based on the Mexican figures of Tiburcio Vasquez and Joaquin Murrieta, who were immortalized in Mexican folk narratives. Latinidad is essentially coded into the superhero DNA. So then it does matter that Miles is Afro-Latino, and his identity as such grounds him to his fundamental identity as a superhero. Miles solidifies his identity as a superhero, an Afro-Latino, and a man within the film through the projections of his subjective experience onto the environment, which thereby inform his subjectivity, just like real life. Morales reminds us, we all, to some extent, straddle multiple worlds, and while we may be thrown into overwhelming situations, we still get to decide how we live in those worlds and shape them. If it's true that I am unable to constitute my own identity without interaction with the environment around me or input from the others around me, without each other individual's very perception of me, then I must acknowledge that I hold all those different versions of myself constantly within me. I am a dynamic individual that unites varied subjectivities. So if all this is true, then isn't animation the best form for presenting subjective and emotional experiences? I mean, Eisenstein seemed to think so, as he envied animation's ability to change the forms of a character to illustrate their evanescent identity, their dual or multiple natured, and he envied how animation could illustrate and express metaphorically the character's change in temperament or mood. So if animation can depict multiplicity, then it is the perfect medium to depict the Afro-Latino character of Miles Morales. He depicts both his individual subjectivity and all the various identities that surround him and inform him. He is his own diaspora in animated filmic form. The Caribbean writer Edouard Glissant once said, "It's the moment when one consents not to be a single being and attempts to be many beings at the same time. In other words, for me, every diaspora is the passage from unity to multiplicity." All right, so then where in the film Into the Spider-Verse do we find Miles struggling with his identity and exhibiting his subjectivity through the background and environment? Well, I have a few sequences in mind. Both include his father, Jefferson. The first sequence I'd like to highlight is the one with Jefferson when he reveals to Miles that Aaron has died, though unbeknownst to him, Miles already knows. Unfortunately, they never see each other since Miles is webbed to an office chair and unable to open the door to his dorm. In this sequence, there are 3 windows, and therefore 3 light sources. The first is behind Jefferson. A single window illuminates Jefferson and the hallway he is in with soft, ethereal light. The second two windows are in Miles' dorm, both behind him in the first shot. They shed very little light on his character model. Instead, he's bathed in shadows, visually stuck between the two lights and between two of his many identities, a son and a Spider-Man. And as Miles moves closer to the door that separates him from his father, he moves further into shadow and darkness. While this moment could be read to foreshadow some of the events of Across the Spider-Verse, and maybe even beyond the Spider-Verse, I think the more prescient read lies in the study of light in this moment. Jefferson offers a gentle, welcoming light that beckons to Miles, just as the tenderness in Jefferson's tone does. The love between them is given emotional weight in the dynamic lighting as both of their subjectivities inform the environment that surrounds them. This emotional intelligence carries through to the end of the film as Miles speaks to his father, as Spider-Man. As the PDNY cleans up in the background after the disaster caused by the collider, a light shines down diagonally from the top of screen right towards screen left where Jefferson stands. And though the light lands on the ground in the background, marginally in the center of the screen, I think its direction toward Jefferson and his further backlighting implies that he's the source of hope for Miles, as the film affirms identity formation in close relation to loved ones, especially through embraces or hugs. Once again, Miles' own subjectivity is transferred onto the diegetic background when the only source of visible light is focused upon Jefferson, which compels Miles to finally throw himself into that light. What I find truly incredible is that Across the Spider-Verse allows Gwen to occupy a similar space, or in this case maybe a non-space, with her own father on multiple separate occasions as they struggle to navigate their relationship. Now the Spider-Verse is also interested in presenting us with female subjectivities as well, and does so with astonishing and striking effect. The color from one element of Gwen's universe bleeds through to other elements of her world, until they are often entirely consumed by the other colors or textures, in moments that I find to be the most gorgeous and impressionistic in the entire series of these films so far. Every encounter with her father breathes an emotionality that is delivered through the backgrounds as it is informed by both characters' subjectivities. Their first encounter truly flaunts the painterly, almost watercolored quality to Gwen's universe. As her and her father are divided by distance, a white line interjects into the frame, physically dividing them with comic book stylization. But as the main light source exudes from behind the open door her father is in, illuminating him in a soft ethereal light, not unlike the earlier moment with Jefferson, Gwen is beckoned toward him. She rushes to him to embrace him, and her subjectivity spills out all over the screen. A barely translucent interjection of light pink begins to bloom out from their hug and begins engulfing her room. Later, when she encounters her father after the fight with Vulture, he fires his gun in the air in warning at Spider-Woman, not knowing it's his daughter. And the Spider-Verse exhibits one of its best pop frames to date. However, the sequence that follows the pop frame is extremely impressionistic. After she reveals to her father that she is Spider-Woman, the film repeats a frame from before the reveal, and Captain Stacy's background has sharpened into a bright orangish red, as if to caution him. As Gwen attempts to convince her father that she is morally just as Spider-Woman, he denies her every attempt, essentially naming her a murderer. The camera bounces back and forth between them as both subjectivities begin to inform the backgrounds and environments once again. This time, all diegetic backgrounds fall away for purely abstract and impressionistic compositions. Shades of red color each character's perception of the other, illustrating how they feel threatened by each other. As Captain Stacy decides to stay within the black and white confines of the law, he is surrounded by those two colors. A thick white line sits on either side of him, while a deep black line rests just behind him. These lines switch to red and white respectively as he feels more threatened by his daughter and unsure of her own subjectivity. As such, horizontal red brushstrokes radiate from Gwen and collide with the white space that her father exudes. In the frames where the colors meet, Gwen's red brushstrokes are disintegrated by her father's white space. The mapping of emotions and subjectivities onto the background of the sequence is followed up with and developed later in the film, again with Gwen and her father. Towards the end of the film, they have one final encounter before she leaves to save Miles. When they start speaking, her father is surrounded by a muted green-white light. His shirt, pants, and his tie just kind of blend into the brush strokes of each other. But as he reveals how horrible he's felt since he left, he and Gwen face each other. When this happens, he is drenched in darkness, and his background continues to darken, while Gwen emits a soft pink light. Gwen continues to berate him, and their environment begins to dissolve around them, becoming more abstract every second. Every single frame in this sequence retains some mysterious, ethereal essence through the abstract and impressionistic compositions exhibited in the background. Finally, Captain Stacy tells Gwen, "You're the best thing I've ever done." And suddenly she sees him, and rather conspicuously, not much else. To frame the characters and emphasize the importance of their emotional encounter, the animators employ compositions that feature a moving, abstract constellation of colors that are reminiscent of the kinetic sculptures of Alexander Calder. Gwen pulls him in with her web for a hug, and as they embrace, the entire environment around them simply falls away. In a stunning wide shot of the hug, there is almost no color in their environment that isn't attached to their character models, and the lines of their environment are converted into simple pencil-sketched lines. Both of their emotions and subjectivities bleed into the frame around them, draining it of color. Because Gwen and her father believe nothing else matters in the moment, the film feels the same way, and we as spectators are left with nothing but their loving embrace. Now, while I've beaten a dead horse about the animation style of the film, I want to take a moment to highlight another important element of this sequence. I find it interesting that in a sequence where proximity is essential, Shea Wiggum, who plays Captain Stacy, and Haley Steinfeld, who plays Gwen, recorded their lines in a room together in a time when separate audio recording sessions for different performers is becoming more common. Kemp Powers, one of the directors of Across the Spider-Verse, recalls, "We actually put actors together for some particularly dramatic moments. A great example would be George Stacy and his daughter Gwen near the end of the movie. Shea Wiggum and Haley Steinfeld are in the room together so that they are able to react to the performance of the other person." I mention this only to suggest that the filmmakers are aware of the importance they put on the physical proximity of bodies through hugs and embraces. And that's fantastic. But where do all these painterly and abstract compositions leave us? Well, as I've stated, I believe that Into and Across the Spider-Verse both aim to transfer characters' subjective emotional experiences onto their background or environments in beautiful and abstract compositions through the 2D texturing of the 3D environments. Through these impressionistic and abstract compositions that form themselves behind the protagonists, the spectator is given a look into their subjective experience through a new language of animated filmmaking. What becomes most conspicuous is the presence of non-white and non-male subjectivities in these spaces. It's as if the animation medium itself advanced its visual language in order to portray non-white subjectivities properly and respectfully, when in fact animators, the people truly behind the incomplete 2.5D style, are developing this aesthetic in response to their need to find new ways of portraying identities that are constituted by non-white and non-male subjectivities. The style itself mirrors the protagonists. Just as Miles and Gwen's identities are evolving and changing, so is animation by attempting to carve out a space for something new. Just as Miles bounces between his different constructions of identities, constantly occupying a space that lies somewhere between Miles and Spider-Man, and thereby affirming the unstable identities of real-life Afro-Latinos, the animation itself refuses stability. This further contextualizes the reversibility between outsides and insides that occur between characters and their environments within both films. I mean, this is even literalized in the diegesis in Across the Spider-Verse through the presence of multiple various spider people, many of whom are spider women, or even a different species, or just a car. However, if we are seeking reciprocity within that reversibility between subjectivity and environment, the Spider-Verse may disappoint us. The characters seem to violently react within the diegesis to the mixed mediums. I speak of the glitches that so many of the spider people fall victim to when out of their own universe, at least without one of Miguel's watches. And here we have the main opponent to the new mixed and abstract animation style, Miguel. His anxiety about keeping canon events feels like an overly honest stand-in for the major animation studios and how this new animation style has begun to shake up the industry. And while neither Spider-Verse will ever fully disavow these new animation styles they've ushered in, there is a sense that the filmmakers and animators are troubled about where animation goes from here. The incomplete 2.5D animation style continues to proliferate throughout Hollywood, gradually developing a counter-programming to the hegemonic 3D animation style. So where could this franchise and this new animation style go from here then? Unfortunately, we may not know for a while due to the ongoing writer and actor strikes. I want to take this chance to acknowledge the allegations of animator abandonment during Across the Spider-Verse's production, and say that it's simply ridiculous that what I've called the incomplete 2.5D animation style, the generally less finished looking style that I've been speaking on, may have come about through painstaking labor exploitation. But I'll get down off my soapbox so we can move on. It's no secret that this animation style is becoming more and more popular. Even one of the directors of Across the Spider-Verse, Joaquin Dos Santos, recognizes Into the Spider-Verse's impact. He says, there was a before Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse time and an after Spider-Verse time with regards to feature animation. And when that film landed, it planted a flag. Dos Santos even expresses his excitement about where the Spider-Verse and films like them will take the animation medium from here. I think Across the Spider-Verse pushes the edges. I'm excited to take the momentum of Across the Spider-Verse and apply it to animation moving forward. To get some context for where the medium is headed, let's look at where other studios have picked up the style so far. Netflix has produced the lion's share of new content in this incomplete 2.5D style. We've got 2019's Klaus, 2021's Mitchell's vs. the Machines, 2021's League of Legends inspired television series Arcane, 2022's Intergalactic, and 2023's Demona. And I'm sure I missed a few in there, but if I were to highlight one, it would be Intergalactic. This visual album from Kid Cudi almost represents a bridge between Into and Across the Spider-Verse, as the visual and oral aesthetics feel identical to the Spider-Verse films. From DreamWorks, we've got 2022's The Bad Guys and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. I enjoyed Puss in Boots quite a bit, but found it to be a bit over-reliant on opaque white speed lines. And as I mentioned, Pixar almost picks up the aesthetic in Elemental, while the studio refuses to step outside its safe space of 3D volumetric animation. So looking ahead, Disney Animation Studios seems to be picking up the incomplete 2.5D animation style in Wish, which is hopefully still releasing on November 22nd of this year. However, I think Paramount has best picked up the style and, let's say, mutated it with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. The Paramount logo immediately employs the aesthetic with speed lines emanated from the logo's stars as they fly towards the mountain in the opening of the film. Throughout the film, light sources exude dynamic shifting lines and brush strokes, even from the screen of the in-narrative outdoor film screening of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Every speed line and impact line is colored to correlate with the object or character it belongs to. Human faces are strangely asymmetrical, and the backgrounds and environments are much flatter and more noticeably 2D than those in the Spider-Verse films. All that said, animation seems to be in a great place right now. Though the hegemonic 3D animation style seems to be falling out of favor with filmgoers, the incomplete 2.5D animation style is merely in its adolescence and it's picking up momentum. I, for one, am excited to see where this new animation style takes animated feature films, whether it's into the Spider-Verse or maybe somewhere beyond